The British Naval Division should not be confused with the Royal Marines. The Naval Division was created to fit the ambitions of Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill was a descendant of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, and the famous British field commander during the War of the Spanish Succession. Winston Churchill also sought glory on the battlefield, first as a soldier and correspondent in the colonial armies, and in 1914 as minister. The problem was that he was responsible for the navy and not for the army. He circumvented this problem by creating his own infantry force from surplus naval personnel, like stokers. The division was a pure infantry outfit without supporting artillery or other divisional units. The sailors didn't even receive proper infantry training or infantry kit and uniforms. They retained their sailor uniforms and ranks. They were issued rifles and took some target practice. To bolster morale, the battalions were named after British naval heroes like Drake, Hood and Nelson. Spirits were high, but they would be no match for regular German infantry. The combat value of the Naval Division was somewhat augmented by the addition of battalions of Royal Marines. Early October 1914, the division was hastily thrown in the front line in the Battle for Antwerp to bolster the Belgian defences of the national redoubt. It turned out to be a disaster, because the Belgians were already in the process of retreating. The untrained and inexperienced naval division took heavy losses, and some of its elements became trapped in the German encirclement of Antwerp and chose internment in Holland over capture. Churchill oversaw all of this, as he was personally present at the deployment of the naval division. After the disaster of Antwerp, the division was called back to Britain and patched up. There was even a special recruitment drive to make up for the losses in manpower. The division was spared the development of trench warfare on the Western Front for the time being. In April 1915, the division became involved in another typical Churchillian plan, the Gallipoli campaign. The division was involved in the first landing and took horrendous losses and suffered the same fate as the Australians and the New Zealanders. Within 1 month, the division suffered 7,500 casualties caused by frontal assaults and ravaging disease. It would eventually suffer 10,000 casualties. In the summer of 1916, the Naval Division was a shadow of its former self, and it was withdrawn to Marseille for refit and deployment on the Western Front. This time, the Navy could no longer spare men to replenish the division, and the division was transferred to Army Command. The irony was that the disgraced Churchill followed the Naval Division to the Western Front, but not with the division this time. The Naval Division was redesignated the 63rd Royal Naval Division and was refitted as a regular army division with support units like artillery and outfitted with army uniforms. The division also received army recruits to replenish the ranks. This was the start of the gradual replacement of naval casualties with army recruits within the division. In November 1916, the division was deployed in the last push of the bloody British Somme offensive, which had begun in July 1916. It was the first real action of the division after its rebuilding, and it was an unfortunate one. The autumn rain had turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. The divisional Christmas card even featured a floating raft of soldiers to reflect the frontline condition.
On the map you can see the starting position of the Royal Naval Division on November 13th and the final push of the Somme offensive, in which the Naval Division played a significant role. It came however with heavy casualties. The Butcher's Bill 1 week later, the end of the offensive on November 19th, was 4,000 casualties. Despite its poor record, the Royal Naval Division was slated for the Battle of Arras in April 1917, also known as the Battle for Vimy Ridge. The division managed to capture Gavrelle, a village which was its direct objective, and the division held it against frantic German counterattacks. But this modest success came at a cost of 3,000 casualties. This meant that the division had to be rebuilt after only a half year of action on the Western Front. In October 1917, the division fought once more alongside the Canadians in the Second Battle of Passchendaele. It once again went on the offensive in the November mud of Flanders with similar result. Less than 1 kilometer of gains at the cost of 1,000 casualties after 2 weeks of fighting. The agonizing year 1917 ended with a ferocious German attack on the division near Cambrai in December. In the beginning of 1918, the division was officially downsized to 9 battalions, and it was the year when the last original Royal Naval battalions were disbanded as well. The division was hard hit by the German Spring Offensive, when it was gassed and lost 2,500 men. It had to conduct a fighting withdrawal. The British bent but did not break. The division was involved in the final British offensive to break through the Hindenburg Line and ended the war around Mons in Belgium, where the British Expeditionary Force saw its first action in 1914. The Royal Naval Division was created to fit the ambitions of Winston Churchill in Belgium in 1914 and Turkey in 1915. Despite its connection with the Navy and despite for having Royal Marines in its midst, it was never an elite unit. It suffered tremendous casualties. By the end of the war, 47,000 casualties were suffered by the division. It had little to show for these losses, but that doesn't mean they were bad soldiers. They had the misfortune to be born in a generation of men whose lives were destroyed in what was called the Great War.